Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you. My name is Rob Havers. I am the President and CEO of this wonderful institution, the American Civil War Museum, and it is a very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for what will be a fantastic program. It is great, masks and social distancing notwithstanding, it is great to have a well-attended in-person event. It has been quite some time. Tonight's program, this important conversation, is possible because of our community partners, the Black History Museum, the Cultural Center of Virginia, and it is a very great pleasure to partner with you this evening. We thank them for their important contributions to the program and for the meaningful work that they do and the positive impact that they have. So we look forward to continuing to work together on our common efforts to connect history and current culture and to preserve the stories that inspire. Thank you all very much for being here this evening for this special program. I hope to see you all again at other programs in the very near future. So thank you for coming. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly.
Thank you. And all right. And again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator or Manager here at the museum, so I'm going to do what I always do and give a few announcements before tonight's program gets underway. Although we are starting to do some in-person programs, we still have a number of virtual programs that we're offering. So on November 8th at 6:30, which is next Monday, we'll have a virtual history happy hour. This is going to be the James W. Bland story and how former slave voters played a vital role in Virginia's acceptance back into the Union. This will be with Appomattox historian, the Reverend Al Jones. And then on November 11th at 6:30, we will have a book talk with Alex Rossino, also a virtual program, There, Maryland, which offers a different view of Lee's Maryland campaign. And then on November 18th, we will have a second live program for the month. And this is a book talk with Jack Trammell, who will be speaking on Civil War Richmond. And I have one more program that I'm going to go ahead and announce, even though it is in December, but it's a program I think this audience might be interested in. On December 9th at 6:30, we will have a book talk with Warren Miltier, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South. And Miltier is a professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. So that's it for announcements. And now I'm going to introduce the moderator for tonight's program and also a panelist, Anna Edwards. She is a public historian, and she is also the supervisor of visitor engagement and interpretation here at the American Civil War Museum. Anna also contributed research and interpretive planning for two current exhibitions. One is Southern Ambitions, which is upstairs, and the other is an online exhibit called Contested Franchise. Since 2004, Anna, as chair of the Defenders Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, has lectured, written articles, and advocated to preserve and expand understanding of the early African and African American history of Richmond. She's done this by helping lead the community effort to establish a 9-acre memorial park in Shockoe Bottom, the city's founding neighborhood. So without further ado, Anna, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Rob, for the welcome and for the introductions and for the appreciation. We have really a really wonderful panel of people, and I have had the pleasure of working with all of them in various capacities over many years, which is always nice to be able to say. The program tonight, the premise for the program tonight is the idea that we have new opportunities to recenter the way that we interpret what we have understood about the American Civil War. And in this, here in the American Civil War Museum, we have an intriguing maybe even more intriguing opportunity, just because of the situation that we have, the many situations that we have gone through recently. So this is a very particular moment in time, and one of the things that I wanted to sort of speak to just before I introduce our wonderful panelists is just to say that it is because of that moment that even histories that people in the field have known about for a long time finally began to percolate its way into the public sphere, so much so that we now have sort of young people on the street who have made those connections and are beginning to turn to institutions like this and like the Black History Museum and to scholars that we might typically not have heard of before for an understanding, for explanations about that history and how it contributes to the realities and the legacies of what we are coming to understand. So this is, a conversation, and it will be really good, I know, automatically. But at the same time, it's not a final conversation. It's a way to maybe be able to identify some of the questions that we have and hear perspectives from some people who have been involved in addressing these questions in different ways over the years. So I'm going to go ahead and let you know who all these fine people are, and then we will get started with the first question. So there at the far end is Elvatrice Belsches. She is a public historian, an archival researcher, she's a presenter, and a documentary filmmaker. She's the author of Black America series, Richmond, Virginia, published by Arcadia, and we actually have copies here and in the back, so remember what that means for you. She has also contributed several biographical entries for the African American National Biography, published by Oxford University Press. She has contributed to a 3-part series called When Freedom Came for the Richmond Free Press, which is a local African American newspaper, and was recognized as runner-up for the Journalistic Integrity and Community Service Award by the Virginia Press Association in 2016. Elvatrice also served as an in-studio researcher on Steven Spielberg's motion picture Lincoln in 2011, and her contributions can be seen in the film. She is a 2020 recipient of a Virginia Humanities Fellow, and that means that she is working at the library. Oh, it didn't print, but it's for the film on Virginia Randolph, who is a Virginia educator, and so look forward to that. It also means she's at the library with Lois, but I'm going to get to Lois in just a second. Mary Lauderdale is Operations and Visitor Services Manager of the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. She moved to Richmond from Philadelphia in 1995. She had first learned about the Black History Museum after viewing a spot on the 12 o'clock news that the museum was looking for new volunteers, and she was hooked. 2 years later, she was offered a temporary position, and it has now been a 23-year labor of love. She's paid now. Mary has served as frontline staff, chief docent, visitor, and volunteer services. She's gift shop manager and operations manager. She is also a founding member of the Sisters of the Yam, an African American Quilters Guild, which has been meeting at the museum since the Guild's formation in 2001. And if you have never been to the museum to see the quilt exhibition, I highly recommend it. It's one of those crafts and gifts that we take for granted, I think. But there's incredible artistry and skill, and they represent an incredible tradition in America. So, gotta go see those quilts. She is also, Mary says that Virginia's Black history is America's history, and it offers a wider view of history and culture to learn and interpret. She says, I love interacting with our patrons. We have visitors come from all the continents, leading interpretive tours with interactive exhibitions. High tech with high touch, as she describes it, serves to enhance the museum experience. Lois Leveen is in Richmond because she is a Virginia Humanities Fellow at the Library of Virginia, where she is researching the first book-length biography of the real figure who inspired the 2014 novel that was a critically acclaimed publication back in 2014. This is The Secrets of Mary Bowser. So this is the historical fiction about a beloved Richmond character who has gone through a journey of her own in terms of what we actually know about her and what we sometimes think we'd like to know about her. So she is also a former faculty member at UCLA and Reed College. She frequently leads programs at museums and other cultural institutions. And she has written about race and American history for The Atlantic, The New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, blackpast.org, and many other publications. So this is your panel for tonight. So I hope you are stacking up your questions, even if you haven't written them down yet. So, all right, so what we decided as a group was that we would respond to 3 questions that we formulated in order to get into kind of the meat of what we discussed means in terms of examining what it means to not simply look at the American Civil War through what we consider sort of a universal lens, or the way that historians tend to have traditionally written about things as if we are all on the same page in terms of how we receive that information. In the perspective of the African American or Black experience of the Civil War is one which there have been Black historians all along. Many people don't quite realize that there have been Black historians since the 18th century who have been weighing in on these issues, and yet their publications were not taken seriously, and therefore not promoted, and therefore not widely understood, and therefore their analyses of things were not factored in. At the same time, we also have Black historians and scholars who have studied many other topics and have weighed in, and their contributions were not considered appropriate for the wider sort of academic track. And so, so this is an opportunity to sort of unpack what's already, in many ways, already known.
Kelly, I've done programs for the American Civil War Museum in the past, but I don't live in Richmond, so when Kelly heard I was going to be here, she asked if I wanted to do a program, and I paused. Now, when you write and teach, and I include museum work as part of teaching, about the history of race in America, there are a few big challenges. One is that you never want to sugarcoat how pernicious and ubiquitous white supremacy has been throughout the history of the United States and even colonial America before that. But when we put the focus there, we can also miss all of the resistance and resilience of African Americans and other people of color, which has also been there the whole time, right? And that can be a little bit tricky to see people not just as done to, but as doers. So that was in my mind. And what Anna was just saying about the add-on, in the past few years especially, whether it's museums or textbooks or college courses have suddenly been saying, oh, maybe we should start addressing the Black experience as well. Maybe we should start addressing race as well. And I think that that always feels like an add-on if it doesn't cause us to really rethink the assumptions that have been operating in our institutions, in our textbooks, in our classes the whole way through. And it also, honestly, never quite gets it right. And so I will use the example of my own research, right? That in the past, probably 2 decades since biography, an excellent biography about Elizabeth Van Leeuwen came out, and then I wrote a novel, and now I'm, as my penance, doing the much harder work of actually researching the real life. This story has circulated and gotten people very excited about the Union Underground that operated in Richmond during the Civil War. But that story is usually told as though a bunch of white Unionists sometimes relied on Black people, enslaved or free, to help them in their goal of defeating the Confederacy. You can tell the story that way, and it's not an untrue story, but there were decades and centuries of resistance and resilience here in Richmond that involved strategies developed by enslaved and free black people who had strong and resilient families and communities and religious institutions and social institutions. And I like to think of this story as a story of they were surviving and to the extent that they could in the face of white supremacy thriving. And then the Civil War came along and they used the white unionists to get what they wanted done, rather than the white unionists just using them to get what the white unionists wanted done. So with all of this in my head, I said to Kelly, well, I would love to do a program, if that is the program that you would like me to do. And Anna and I have known each other for 10 years, Anna. And so I said, well, I knew that Anna had come to the museum. I said, what if I did a conversation with Anna? And Anna and Kelly did me much better because they decided that they would partner with the Black History Museum and have Mary be part of this conversation, and invite Elva, who's so deeply in the work here with the history of Richmond. And maybe I have some more of a national perspective as well to bring to the conversation. But this is like my dream came true, but like way better than I dreamt it. So that's why I'm here for this conversation, because where else would you want to be?
So, Mary, why did you decide to do this?
Well, as some of you know, many of you know, the Black History Museum's mission is to preserve stories that inspire. And so I wanted to be here to talk about the few stories that we do know, the undertold stories, the untold stories, and to maybe start to flesh out the stories of those thousands of families that were never told, weren't written down, how they survived, how they, you know, what they felt about freedom, what they felt about the Civil War. We don't have a lot of, or not widely dispersed information on this, and I felt it was important to delve into some of the individual stories, because history is history, and facts and figures and places have been represented, but not so much the heart of what this history means. The history, how it has defined how we interact with each other, how we don't interact with each other, and that Black history has not always been, as these ladies were saying, part of America's history. It's not the first thing people think of, that it's just America's history. It's not Black history, it's America's history. We are an integral part of what made this country. And what I was really thinking about when I started thinking about this topic was the children that survived during that time, what they were going through. No, I don't think that we emphasize a lot on what about the children. So that's why I wanted to be on this.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I am grateful to be a part of this because I am able to see a lot of subjects that aren't really in the purview of public history, where scholars, know certain things, but there are certain subjects that need to be amplified. And what I've seen over the last 20 plus years, for an example, of things like really introducing the slave trade, 101. I'm not interested in the economics so much as I am the humanity, as it relates to the trade and the victims of that trade. One of the things that I've seen is that people really don't talk a lot about the free Black experience. So I created a project, it's ongoing, and a presentation, and people are hungry for those kind of things. I've done it 3 times, and it was standing room only 2 of those 3 times because people are hungry about those things. Believe it or not, there are a lot of people who believe that all of our people were enslaved. And they're stunned to know, for an example, that in Virginia, in terms of cities in 1860, Petersburg led all cities. There weren't many cities, by the way, here in Virginia, with about 3,200 free Blacks, and Richmond was second with about 2,600 free Blacks. What were their lives like? And so, I've taken it from the 1700s on down. And we can learn a lot from that. And also, I believe that I wanted to be a part of this because we can learn a lot about how people, both enslaved and free, mitigated the effects of inequality. You're going to be surprised. I think I'll have time to give a few examples of the fact that even 200 years ago, people understood the importance of education. I need to center, and this is something I don't see a lot, we need to center the importance of the Black church historically, because it was the center of the Black universe. I can talk about social justice initiatives that were undertaken 200 years ago here, and I'll provide examples. There are examples of people who were enslaved that had their own businesses, and they were actually able to purchase family members while they were still enslaved. And so I see a lot of things as an archival researcher that defy what we think we know. You know, I'll go through 3,000 pages in a day to find that one thing that really, people have been looking for. As far as being a freelancer, I'm not affiliated with any one place, so I get to have fun at different places. For an example, in 2020, I was commissioned by Wade Rawls to research and acquire the photographs for the Wall of Faces that you see at the American Civil War Museum in Appomattox. In 2013, Christy Coleman called me in here to be a special projects researcher while I culled the names of hundreds, or if not thousands, of enslaved men, women, and children who worked for Tredegar or were hired, around the state. Also, with and I've also been blessed to go to Farmville and do a happy hour on Elizabeth Keckley for the American Civil War Museum. And also I've worked with projects with the Black History Museum, so it's fun to be able to be a freelancer. You get to learn a lot of things, but you get to see a lot of things that aren't really in that public history realm. And my calling, quite frankly, is as an educator. And so as soon as I learn something, I want to share it, because there's so many things that just aren't in that public purview yet that are stunning, and I hope to amplify some of those stories this evening.
We really kind of wanted to then get into some specifics, some examples for you in terms of where we're each coming from, as we engage this topic. And so 400 years of Black views on and aspirations for survival, freedom, and citizenship as a lens through which to examine the Civil War gives us an opportunity to say, how can we use these stories to expand not just the narratives, but the lenses through which they are understood or experienced. And I do think, Albert, that you were already sort of taking us into that. But I'm gonna ask Mary to respond first.
Wow. As I was speaking about earlier, I look for some of the individual stories. I'll even go back as far, everybody knows about Henry Box Brown. I don't know if many people know his story, that he had a wife and children that were sold away. And that's what was his impetus for just, I'm going to get out of here. The love story that is about, he reportedly, when he found out his wife and children were being sold from him, he caught up to them, he came back into town, he cut his hand. And he left work and he came to find his wife and children. And he walked up to his wife and they grabbed hands. And he walked with her until he wasn't allowed to go any further. They didn't speak to each other. Think about that love story. This man is losing his wife and children. He has no power. I know that they're long gone, but that always speaks to me. I get very emotional talking about the story, so I kind of gloss over a little bit of it. But we're not talking about a man that was beaten, mistreated. The slavery thing, just the fact that a man is powerless to help his family. Just think about that. Other stories, such as Lucy Good Brooks, who started an orphanage for those formerly enslaved children. Now, they're left in the children are now free, but where do they go? They don't have their parents. They know nothing, there's no way for them to be, there's no place for them to go. And for her to take the pain of losing one of her children to be sold away, for her to take that pain and to change that into helping other children, other orphans, and founding a place for them, that is a beautiful story of sharing with children. And there's just so many others that we can talk about. But that's what I want to emphasize, some of the individual stories that we don't normally think about, that just everyday survival, what it would take to make it in this world after suffering some of the things that they suffered. And talking about a time period even through today. In those days, no psychiatrist for them to go to. The government isn't supporting, their efforts, so there's no lawyers, there's no nothing centralized for them to go to. Be it, to get help, go talk to a clergyman. A lot of places, a lot of these former enslaved folks were just left to fend for themselves.
So Mary, I'm going to ask a sort of a follow-up, and that is, how do you see how the Black History Museum sort of takes and delivers these stories in a way that, again, I mean, the institution itself really is centered on the Black lens.
Yes.
Yeah, and so.
And by taking each topic and drilling down. And it's going to take, I used to think, hey, one of these days I'm going to work my way out of a job. We're going to be so well educated. But I think that there's so much drilling down to do. Each year we cut off a layer of the surface of what it means to be an African in the Americas. But we have a long way to go to get down to the real meat of what it takes for us to survive. And I think the Black History Museum's role is to uncover these stories, make sure they're told, retold, and further developed. And I've been there 20-something years, and I've seen it change, and I've learned more myself. And I think that it is very important for all of us to understand these stories, because, again, as I said, it's American history, and it makes us all who we are today.
So I'm going to give you two confessions. One is that most of my formal academic training is not actually as a historian. My field of study was African American literature. So Elva and I spent a lot of time doing similar things, looking at all of those documents. But I read like I'm reading works of literature, like they're poems, in the sense that I'm not just looking to extract the information, what is said, but also how it's said. What are the subtexts? What are the contexts? Not just who's speaking, but who isn't speaking. How do we reconstruct the whole story? And the other thing that I will confess, and I hope I don't shock you, is that I'm white. And it means that I always have to be conscious about how whiteness is operating in the work that we are all doing, because nearly every archive in the United States was created by white people for white people. And I don't just mean the audience or the documents. Everything about them assumes that whiteness is central, and that blackness, even if it's depicted as on the edges, on the side, often criminal. That's what we're looking at a lot of times in those records. So you have to be super careful, whoever you are, to read against what the archives are presuming about whose stories deserve to be told. And unlike Elva, I don't get to be here in Richmond all the time, so I feel the press of trying to get through everything as much as I can, those 3,000 documents a day, but I have fewer days. And so often I find myself just saying stop and slow down. And you can go over the Library of Virginia. It is free. You can go anytime, and you will ask for a little help to find it. But you can touch the papers that were the free papers, that were the registrations of free black people from the 1700s and the 1800s. And it's weird, because they're not even standard papers. It looks like you tore that off of your scrapbook, you tore that out of your notebook, and they're just signed. And I'm flying through trying to look for some, and then I have to stop and say, each one of these pieces of paper was a precious, precious thing to a human being. And to just stop and pause in the rush of trying to get to something, to honor each one of those human beings. And as I was doing that yesterday, I thought, how do I really want to think of these pieces of paper? Because you can see them in terms of the blatant harassment of free black people, right? You have to register, you have to, if you were liberated after a certain date, you had to get permission just to stay in the Commonwealth of Virginia. If you wanted to move from Petersburg to Richmond, you had to get permission from the city of Richmond to live here. You had to renew those documents periodically. You were charged fees for all of these things. If you had to appear in court, you didn't get paid time off from your work. So it was like harassment, it was financial burden, it was a way of saying, we don't really want to tolerate you here. And you can look at those pieces of paper and think about that. That's the don't sugarcoat the racism side of the story. But remember to flip it and also think about resistance. Every single one of those little scraps of paper is somebody saying, I have a right to be. I have kin, I have community, I have a place. This is my place, and I am going to claim this place. And you're going to make it hard for me to claim this place, but I am not going to be dissuaded. I am every one of those pieces of paper is like an incredible triumph. And the few words on the page are never going to capture the whole story of who that kin was, what that community looked like. Did I go to First African Baptist Church, or did I go to Ebenezer Baptist Church? Or maybe it was a smaller kind of our own community doing a thing because we didn't want to be under a white preacher. I won't ever know the whole story from those scraps of paper, but just to stop, to slow down, and to not just think about it in terms of this is the evidence of racism, which it totally is, but this is also the evidence of strategies of survival.
Okay. Anna asked us to examine examples of survival, freedom, and I'm going to say my third one was the quest for education as an example. One of the things that I think is important is that we connect the dots between today and yesteryear. Because by learning about those coping skills pre-Civil War, those skills serve as a beacon and as a blueprint for today. You know, with COVID, we hear a lot about social determinants of health, correct? With food insecurity, lack of education, where you work. And history allows us to answer how people attempted to mitigate those things, or lack of medical care, access to medical care. History allows us to examine how people mitigated the effects of those things 200 years ago. So I'd like to provide some examples of that quickly. All right. Over 200 years ago, audience, we had a man here by the name of Peter Hawkins who gained his freedom. He was free by 1800. He was known as Richmond's the city's tooth puller, and he actually resided in the area now that would become Jackson Ward in 1871. So keep in mind, this man was born in the 1700s. He not only was the city's tooth puller, he also served as a physician, and I've seen him listed as Dr. Hawkins. That's got to be one of the rarest things in America that you will see. A black man addressed as, or quoted in a document as Dr. Hawkins over 200 years ago. Quick funny story is when Samuel Mordecai wrote a book on Richmond Bygone Days, I think in 1851, he talked about the fact that Peter Hawkins rode around on a raw-boned horse. I guess that meant a horse that was really aged. But if you needed him to extract your tooth, he didn't even dismount his horse. With his really strong wrists, he would pull out his pullakins, and pullakins are actual, they were actual instruments, and he would yank out your tooth without dismounting the horse. As Samuel said, there are times a sound tooth came out with the bad tooth. Nevertheless, he served as a physician here. He actually purchased his wife. So when we talk about agency, and this is one of the things that we don't have enough of in the public history purview. The role of the history of the Black experience in medicine, dentistry, and pharmacy. We don't have to wait until the start of HBCUs. You had people operating as dentists and healers over 200 years ago.
So I'm going to sort of take a stab at answering the question too. I know I'm the moderator, but I had a couple things I wanted to sort of contribute to this idea of the way in which it matters how we look at the historical record, because it tells you, it depends on who writes it, it depends on for what purpose it's written. And so I'm going to work from a couple of newspaper accounts, and this comes out of the fact that for most of the 4 years that I've been here at the museum, I've given guided tours at what is known as the White House of the Confederacy. It's also known as the House on Clay Street. It's also known as the Broken Brow House, the Crenshaw House. It has many names, including the Central Public School, as well as having served literally that building as the Confederate Museum in its first 80 years of existence. So this is a building which has a lot of stories to tell. And the stories that we've been telling there in recent years, in particular since the two institutions merged, have been an attempt to unpack the other people who lived and worked there, but also the context in which that house existed during the Civil War. So it isn't just that it was the Confederate president's house, it's also that it was the house on the hill, on Shockoe Hill, that overlooked Shockoe Valley in the years when Richmond was about to wrap up, having become the second largest slave trading district in the country for the domestic slave trade. So putting it into that context, helps sort of expand again the narratives that have come out of that house traditionally, which have only been about the Davis family or the Confederacy and its sort of primacy in that moment here in Richmond. One of the stories that we tell in there is about a man named Henry, and Henry served as a butler. He was enslaved. He was somebody who was there on a lease contract. You may have heard people use the phrase rented out. And so he was somebody that Jefferson Davis leased from a man in order to serve there for a year. These contracts typically lasted from January through December of each year. Henry serving as a butler, sometimes the description is that he was that he would serve food, or that he was the person who would open the door, which means he's kind of a high-ranking thing. He's kind of in charge of a certain level of operation in the house, and people would report to him. In 1864, January of 1864, Henry left the Confederate president's house. He left under cover of a fire that took place in the basement of the building. The newspaper report is very interesting to read, and the one that we have sort of operated from is one that describes him. So I'm going to read this part first. So Henry, the third servant of President Davis, who has run away within 3 weeks, escaped on Tuesday night and was still at large last evening. And this is from January 21st, 1864. It's believed that some outside influence has brought to bear upon the president's servants to induce them to abscond. All of them are supposed to have gone off with the intention of making their way north. Henry the butler will turn up in the north, the afterrunner of Jeff Davis's coachman. Excuse me, he's referring to a man named William Jackson, who had escaped a couple years before. And like him will form the chief attraction of Puritan lecture rooms and furnish for the press highly interesting and intelligent statements affecting the kitchen arrangements of the presidential mansion as a sequel to the story of the intelligent barber from Richmond that convulsed the whole North a short time ago. And so I imagine they're referring to some famous story that made its way up north. Specific to Henry. Henry, the last candidate. Are you catching that there's a little bit of sarcasm in this report, right? Henry, the last candidate for Yankee ovations, is described as a tall, stoutly built mulatto, well-mannered with a soft voice, which is rather slim in volume for so large a man. He had no quarrel with his master, and no cause can be assigned for his secession, other than he had been recently supplied with a new outfit of clothing and money, which he was very proud of and probably wanted to exhibit it to the Yankees. He was a slave of Robert Ford, and he had been in the president's service for only 2 or 3 months. That's actually incorrect. He'd been there longer than that. Okay, so you're getting a sense of how this is being reported. This comes from the Richmond Examiner in January, the 1824, or 1864. There's a slightly different description that kind of combines talking about Henry, but also talking about Mr. Pemberton. And Pemberton is a man who was also an enslaved person working at the house, but he was owned by Jefferson Davis and had been with the family probably since their time in Mississippi. And so here we have this blending of the two stories because they escaped or left the house within just 2 weeks of each other. Mr. Henry Moseley, a Jeff Davis's dining room servant, has since made his escape and is now in the room with us. Now this is coming from a newspaper called the Anglo-African. It's dated February 6th of 1864, so just a couple weeks after the one I just read to you. The Anglo-African is an African-American newspaper based in New York City, but they had journalists in Richmond and in Norfolk. Mr. Henry Moseley, a Jeff Davis dining room servant, has since made his escape and is now in the room with us. He states that Davis took Pemberton's escape greatly to heart and charged him with ingratitude, as he, Davis, had treated him very kindly. This, Mr. P. says, is true, but how grateful he ought to be to him, the following narrative will show. Mrs. Davis is a very bad woman. And one night, about 10 o'clock, she called Mrs. Pemberton, who was then very ill, from her bed to get something out of a box which she had upstairs. After much labor, Mrs. P. managed to get upstairs and told Mrs. Davis that she was unable to unscrew the box. For saying this, Jeff Davis, who was sitting before the fire, bounded from his seat, knocked her down, and then attempted to choke her. After this, although Pemberton was compelled to attend to all his bodily wants, yet Davis did not exchange a word with him for a month. It was the continued abuse by Davis's wife of Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton that induced them to leave. This last act on the part of Davis was wholly owing to her influence. The basic sort of distinction between these two accounts is that one is coming from the lens of someone who supported and is a part of this enslavement and the slave society and white supremacy, in Richmond, and is speaking to an audience that feels the same way. The Anglo-African is black people speaking to black people at the same moment with their own interpretation of what has gone on. Now, they weren't writing absolutely parallel stories, so it's not that, but you get a very clear sense of how important it is to actually look to the sources of people who speak to their own experiences in this time in order to actually understand the impact of those things. You have one set of journalists who are speaking to an audience in the middle of the war. They're very concerned about how this is experienced. The fact that people are escaping from the Confederate president's house, that's kind of newsworthy for people. There's something unstable about this situation that Northern reporters or that African Americans are going to want to exploit so that people understand that there's something else going on here other than the way it's being reported by Southerners or by slaveholders about this experience. And so it's probably been the most illuminating aspect of being a historian, is to realize that if you ask the question a different way, you find your way to more truths, right? More experiences that help inform us what people are talking about in the present, right? The experiences of what people, how people describe the legacies of what it has meant for the United States to actually have been a slave society. We assume and take that language to apply to ancient Rome. But what our United States actually meant by actually being a slave society, and how the end of the Civil War so completely upends that, and that most people were not ready for that, and that therefore we have the continuance of the struggle to sort of fulfill what we think is the ideal that we are supposed to be sort of reaching for.
I just wanted to say something about what you were saying about, actually that speaks to the idea of who is a citizen of the United States. I mean, anybody born here is supposed to be a citizen, so, but even free blacks weren't treated the same way as enslaved folks. And, but any black person would think, well, okay, that's what it says, I'm a citizen, I was born here. So what does citizenship mean to different people within the society that we're talking about? And it's just a question. It's just something for people to think about.
I know that when I was back in graduate school, one of the people that I studied, I did my thesis on a guy named Robert Cowley, and because he was interesting on so many levels, but sort of at the core of it was the idea that he was a free person during slavery, and that meant something. It meant all kinds of things. There were these expectations, or at least in looking back at the documents, we have expectations that, oh, he was free, therefore he could do things. And in fact, the difference between being free and enslaved was often just that. That's it. That was the difference, right? He could own property, which is very different. He could marry, which is very different, but he could not be a full citizen. And so, but one of the things that it begins to point out also is that there is a way of being free during slavery that when slavery ends is suddenly gone, right? But is also a representation of the ways in which people had to, as you used that word, mitigate the circumstances that they found themselves in, to sort of carve out, find the cracks in the system to make it work, and then to sort of then turn, once people were actually free, and figure out what that was going to be. And so Robert Cowley's story is one in which he lived the first half of his life as an enslaved person in the colonial era, lives through the Revolution, and then immediately after, in 1785, he is freed, or he purchases his freedom. He gets a job as a janitor at the Capitol building, and has the keys to the Capitol. And at a certain point in 1800 is implicated in Gabriel's Rebellion, which is sort of the most notorious or famous case of that moment, and manages to survive that implication and go on to live out the rest of his life, presumably dying at the age of 125 in 1820. And again, we found that in the newspapers. His obituary went all up and down the country because it was like, here's a guy who lived to be 120. In one of the accounts, the editor of the newspaper decided to add on a little editorial, which was that, see, if you live a good life and are virtuous and true and loyal and respectful, you too can live to be 125 years old. So there are these really interesting ways in which people are depicted in the record that then require us to, sort of, like you said, go deeper, drill down, and unpack what that actually means. So now what time are we at? 7:29. Oh, okay. So we have a last question here, but I think one of the things we might want to go ahead and do, I'm gonna actually put the question out there, but then I'm also going to go ahead and open it up for the Q&A session. So maybe you all want to sort of contemplate this question as well, and maybe you guys will incorporate your responses to their questions into this question.
So you're asking a question and you're expecting us to keep our mouths shut?
Yes.
For a little bit?
Just a tiny bit.
We'll see if we can do it.
That's right. All right, so, because you've gotten examples of some stories, right? So what are other Black stories that have not been told because their central questions have not yet been asked, because it has not yet occurred to us to ask them, what questions will we be asking in 10 years? And that's, you know, for historians, that's for museum educators, you know, because we all have to sort of take the present day context and make relevant the stories that we want to tell about history. So as we talk about the American Civil War and the People's Contest, which is supposed to give it to you from the experience of all these different kinds of people over the course of the war and the way that that changed and created things, what questions are we responding to now versus what questions will we be responding to going forward? So that's the context, that question, the context for the Q&A session. But you are obviously free to ask whatever question you have. Well, look, audience first, and if you don't, then we'll go here. Yes.
I'd like just to hear your response to critical race theory. And, you know, it's such a, right now, very current topic, obviously. We just had an election in Virginia in which, you know, education and critical race theory was, you know, certainly confused. And I just would like to hear each of you sort of respond to your thoughts about critical race theory and its place in our culture and our education system.
I'll start. I don't think people should be put off by the moniker, because as I interpret it, basically what people are trying to do is explain exactly what happened in history. The horrible things, the things that people were able to do to mitigate those things. And so I think, you know, there are a lot of people who are, you know, upset, but they don't quite understand exactly what that means. If you take away the moniker, then I was to say, okay, we're just going to teach the things that actually happened. We're not going to play any blame game. We're going to call it as we see it, as to what happened. But when that moniker is placed on it, people, you know, get a little concerned. I'll give you an example of something that really made the national news and beyond. In the late 1990s, as some of you recall, in Colonial Williamsburg, they decided to do a live slave auction. And I mean, it made papers even in Europe. People were skeptical about what would come of that. But as I understand it, I'm glad they were brave enough to do it, because when you see what actually happened, it's different than the watered-down versions of happy-go-lucky people you see. And as I understand it, that's a part of the tough stuff of slavery, as they call it. I understand there was a kid there with his parents who happened to be white, and he was so moved by that scenario, he was actually begging his parents to buy that child. If you can infuse that kind of emotion in a child, that child now is 30-something years old, and he gets it, you see. And so, yes, not everything is pretty, but it's not a blame game. People jump to conclusions without really understanding. We're amplifying what occurred here. That's my interpretation of it, sir.
But, so when we talk about critical race theory, I'm great if we're talking about critical race theory. And I am incredibly fortunate enough to have studied critical race theory and to have been a teaching fellow with one of the founders of critical race theory as a field, Kimberly Crenshaw, is probably one of the most brilliant human beings I've ever met. And I think the trick is, you're right, that there's this idea that if we teach about race, it's going to make white people feel bad. If we teach about racism, it's going to make white people feel bad. When I study and teach about race, it makes me think about the challenge we have to do better. It's not about me feeling blame. It's not about me feeling guilty. It's about me feeling the need to make us go from what we have been and what we are to the promise that is in those founding documents, that Declaration of Independence, that Constitution, all of the ideals of America. To me, critical race theory is not an attack, but a challenge to do better. But it is also very much understanding that this is about systems. So one of the first articles I ever encountered that I would consider critical race theory, written by a legal scholar, Cheryl, I'm going to forget her name now, sorry. Whiteness as Property. I want to say Cheryl Harris. I don't really know that one. So Whiteness as Property is an article, and it looks at what's happening in the 1890s when Plessy v. Ferguson is decided. But one of the things that she talks about in that article is that if you create whiteness as a thing that white people have, you defeat the opportunity for working class people to have a commonality across race lines. And that giving poor white people whiteness as property was a way to divide people who had economic interests in common. And guess who benefited from that? It wasn't all white people. It was a small number of white people. But that's part of what critical race theory can help us understand, is the systemic, the structural, and the way that white supremacy definitely benefits white people, but it benefits some white people a whole lot more than most white people. And I think that that's why the people who are really benefited by it don't want you to know about critical race theory and want to froth you up around it.
May I add a quick part A to your question, sir? When I go into elementary schools, of course they're integrated here. The one thing that I try to emphasize is that there have always been people in our corner. And I try to amplify examples of interracial cooperation throughout the eras, so that you've got kids of many ethnicities, for an example, and I let them know, what do you know about, for an example, the Underground Railroad? And I let them know that it was way more than Harriet Tubman, but that white people, Native Americans, and blacks helped facilitate people to freedom. And so it's not about us versus them, it's about right versus wrong. Yeah. And that way you don't have students looking at someone else saying, oh my goodness, your people did this to me. But you've got to, I let them know, even as elementary kids, that I know of white ship owners here who lost their ships. They were arrested because they, hid black people in their ships or on their ships and carried them to freedom. I know of stories where Native Americans here assisted people and elsewhere. So I let them know, again, it's not about us versus them, it's about right versus wrong. And there have always been people who are willing to do the right thing.
And I was going to say it's about facts too. We recently closed an exhibition that was about slavery at Monticello. And we had a list of the 607 enslaved folks that were at Monticello. We talked about Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, but yet he had all these enslaved folks there. We talked about the work that they did, what he allocated for those enslaved folks, and how he treated them. And in his own words, he really did think black people were inferior to whites. And so a reporter came out, and she's walking around looking at facts. And a lot of this we knew from his own journals, from his own documents. And she said, wow, y'all really could have done a number on this man, You could have bashed him. I said, it wasn't about bashing Jefferson. It was just letting the facts speak for themselves, just like we should be doing in the textbooks.
So my question is a little bit different. It's about the future. And the question circles around the use of data to sort of unpack history in a more factual and dynamic way. So my question is there any type of work being done to look at our primary source material and narratives and combine that with data analytics and other technology that allows us to draw conclusions quicker and more objectively?
So I love that question. I'm going to jump on that one. There are things that I want to raise up, and there are things I want to challenge about that. One is this notion of objectivity, because I think we have this story of objectivity, and it goes along with erasing whiteness, really. That there's one truth, and we can just get to that truth. Like I said, it's true that the white unionists, when they needed black people to get to their goal, would rely on black people. But it's also true that black people, when they needed the white unionists to rely on their goal, would use the white unionists, right? That those are two stories that are both true at the same time. And I think when we talk about objectivity, we can move towards accuracy, but I think it's really important that we bring our experiences to what we do. There's a reason that I can be a white woman doing this work, and it has a lot to do with the way I reflect on my own experience. And I suspect my conclusions about why I do this work would be different than the other people sitting here, even though we might be doing work that's the same, that's complementary, that's supporting each other and towards the same goals. So I'm a little hesitant to laud objectivity. That said, the data question is totally fascinating, because mostly the way historians work is that you start with a document, or you start with an event and you find the documents around that event, and we often don't see the forest for those trees. And we are at a moment now where the capacity to do things with data is totally different. So, mind-blowing statistic on how many transatlantic slave voyages, so these are human beings who have been kidnapped and taken from their home, their culture, their place, and chained, and you don't probably need me to tell you the conditions on the slave ships. On what percentage of slave ships were there uprisings? Turns out, 10%. Way higher than I would have guessed. And statistically, more likely to happen if there were more women who were in the hold as well as men. Totally didn't know that, right? Like, this is new news. So the data is really important because it lets us see, again, the structural, the big picture. Now, for those of you who like an easy homework assignment, I will say there's a documentary called Coded Bias, which came out in the past year. I saw it on PBS. I don't know if you can still access it that way. Coded Bias. And it is a brilliant young MIT scholar who basically, she wanted to do something else with her life, but she fell into realizing how much of artificial intelligence has bias coded into it. So for example, if you are applying for a job, right, you put your resume in, and now human beings don't look at your resume, bots scan your resume, right? And if the bots know that in our company, we've hired successful people from these universities, they look for resumes from people from those universities. That sounds great, but if we have never hired somebody from an HBCU, then their resume is never going to get looked at, right? And it's the same for if you play women's sports versus men's sports. So there are all sorts of ways that that bias gets coded, and that's one example about the resume searches, but it's true all over. So you are hitting on the capacity of data to help us be more accurate in our stories, to help us see big picture as well as, because we love the heartwarming stories, right? We want to know those figures from history, but it helps us understand the big picture, but we also have to be careful not to jump on data as objective or true, because it is, again, you can't, as they say, the fish can't see the water it's swimming in. And so when our data comes out of the systems that we are already in, it is not necessarily doing the good work we want it to do.
I hope I'm not causing trouble, but this is not criticism of y'all. This has been a marvelous event tonight. But I'm a retired forensic accountant, and we had a good saying which was figures never lie, but liars figure. And one of the problems I have in this day and age especially is I read something, I have to verify, and verify. And it is so extremely tough to really sit down and say, I believe what this person is saying. And I think this is one of the greatest problems we have right now in getting a story across. Is your story true? I'm not saying it isn't, but is it true? And do I believe this other person is trying to tell me something with the same numbers?
It's a good observation.
Well, you know, in the old days, the lessons historians had was read the footnotes, right? What are the claims and where did the claims come from? But in the world of the internet, right, TikTok ain't got no footnotes.
Yeah, that's right.
Facebook, and I think that is really hard, that we don't have the skills for evaluating where the story is coming from.
Yeah.
And it's easy to believe the story that you want to have be compelling,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's just a given, right? And everything we've said tonight hasn't been footnoted. You have to believe Elva was really looking at all of those documents to come up with the stories. But you can kind of tell she loves them, right?
Yeah.
All right, and on that note.
The last thing, I do want to say one quick thing, no, it's okay, is because that sort of speaks to it, and also just kind of want to leave everybody with this idea that you're in a museum, you're in the American Civil War Museum, and we are, we work hard to present stories and information, right? We expect to live up to the idea that it's a trusted place where you can come and get, good information about the histories, right? And so we also rely on you to tell us what you need us to help you understand. So if you ever get surveys or questions or anything like that for this museum, please respond to them. And if you have those thoughts or ideas, please let us know. Because this institution hopes to go on for a long time, which means we hope to produce a lot of programming and exhibitions that will unpack many of these stories that have not, either not been done before or have not answered a particular question. So, so please do that, and thank